I was 67 years old when my daughter-in-law handed me a garbage bag and told me I had 3 hours to get out of my own house. Not my son's house. Not their house. Mine. The house I'd built with my own hands over 40 years ago. The house where my son had taken his first steps across the kitchen floor. The house where my wife had died in the bedroom upstairs with her hand wrapped around mine. My house. And now I was standing on the porch with a garbage bag containing everything they'd decided I was allowed to keep, watching my son stare at the sidewalk like the concrete was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. I had $25 in my wallet. My Social Security check wasn't due for 11 more days. My son finally looked up. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man who'd been coached on what to say and was delivering the lines with as much feeling as someone reading from a grocery list. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway behind him with her arms crossed, watching to make sure he didn't change his mind. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. He didn't answer. He looked back down at the sidewalk. I turned and walked away because there was nothing else to do. I was 67 years old and I had a garbage bag and $25 and I was walking down the street I'd lived on for 4 decades, and not one of my neighbors came outside. They'd seen. I knew they had. Curtains moved. But no one came out. That's the thing about humiliation. It makes the people watching it uncomfortable enough that they choose not to see it at all. The afternoon was cold. The kind of gray October cold that sits in your chest and doesn't move. I walked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding the full weight of what had just happened. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I walked past the hardware store, past the diner that had been closed for 2 years now, past the post office, past all the landmarks of a life I'd spent in this town, and none of it looked the way it used to. When you belong somewhere, the places you walk through feel like yours. When you don't belong anywhere, those same places feel like sets from someone else's movie. I found a bench outside the library, and I sat down and I put the garbage bag between my feet and I breathed. I went through what I had. 3 pairs of socks, 2 flannel shirts, a photograph of my wife from 1987, standing in the backyard, with her arms out like she was trying to embrace the whole sky. A paperback Bible with a broken spine, my wallet with the $25, my phone with 11% battery and no car charger. 11 days until my next Social Security payment. No family left to call. My wife's sister lived in Phoenix, and we hadn't spoken in years. My friends from work had drifted away when I retired. The kind of loneliness that creeps up on a man over years, until one day he looks around and realizes the drift has carried him very far from shore. I sat there for a long time, long enough that the library closed, and a young woman came out and told me gently that I'd need to move along. She had kind eyes and she looked at the garbage bag with an expression she was trying to hide, and I recognized it because I'd worn it myself when I'd passed men like me on benches like this one. It was the expression of someone who understood that this situation was bad, but didn't know how to help and was grateful that it wasn't their problem. I moved along. The town I'd lived in my whole life suddenly felt designed to keep me moving, to ensure I never stayed anywhere long enough to actually rest. I ended up near the edge of the commercial district, past the last gas station, where the streetlights started getting further apart and the buildings started getting older. And that's when I saw the board. It was a city notices board, the kind bolted to a telephone pole, covered in stapled papers curling at the edges from rain and wind. Normally I wouldn't have stopped. I'd walked past boards like this 10,000 times. But I was cold and my legs hurt, and the pole was close enough to lean against, and so I stopped. Most of the papers were things you'd expect. A lost cat, a church rummage sale, and then, near the bottom, half hidden under a flyer for a piano teacher, a single sheet of cream paper with neat typed lettering, county tax lien auction, unclaimed commercial properties. There were 4 items listed. 3 were parking lots and a warehouse. The 4th one was listed almost as an afterthought. Abandoned diner, Route 9 Junction. Minimum bid $25. I read it 4 times. $25 was exactly what I had. Exactly. Not approximately. Not close. Exactly. I looked at the paper for a long time. The diner on Route 9. I knew that building. I'd driven past it for years. It had been a real place once. Had the kind of hash browns that made people drive 20 minutes out of their way. It closed when the owner had a stroke, and nobody stepped in to take it over. Last time I'd driven past it, the windows were boarded up, and the parking lot was cracked down the middle with weeds growing through it. A man doesn't decide things like this rationally. He decides them the way water decides to flow downhill. Not because he's thought it through, but because there's simply nowhere else to go. I tore the paper off the pole carefully, folded it, and put it in my shirt pocket. The auction was 2 days away. I spent those 2 days at the public library when it was open and at a 24-hour laundromat when it wasn't. A woman named Darlene who worked the overnight shift at the laundromat brought me a cup of coffee on the second night without my asking and set it down next to me without making it into a moment. Just coffee. Just quiet. Just one person acknowledging another person's difficulty without needing to dramatize it. I still think about that cup of coffee sometimes. I found a drive-thru on the first morning and spent $4 on a coffee and $2 menu sandwiches. On the second day, I found a church that ran a free lunch, and I sat at a long table with other men and women who needed a free lunch, and I ate a bowl of chicken soup, and I felt something close to human again. These were not the darkest days of my life, I told myself. These were just days. The auction was held in the basement of the county administrative building. There were maybe 20 people in the room. Investors, mostly, the kind of men who wore khaki and spoke to each other in low voices about square footage and assessed values. Nobody looked at me when I walked in. I was wearing a flannel shirt and carrying a garbage bag, and I understood immediately that I was not the kind of person this room was designed for. The auctioneer worked through the list. Parking lots sold for amounts that made my stomach drop. Numbers with multiple zeros that reminded me with great efficiency exactly how far from this world I actually lived. I stood in the back and waited. When he got to the diner, he actually laughed a little. Not cruelly, just reflexively. The way people laugh at something they find genuinely absurd. Abandoned commercial property, Route 9, he said. Minimum bid $25. And he looked around the room with an expression that said he was going through the motions. A couple of the khaki men smiled at each other. One of them muttered something to his partner, and they both shook their heads. Nobody raised a hand. I raised mine. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that happens when people expected nothing and got something unexpected instead. A dozen faces turned toward me. I didn't look back at them. I kept my eyes on the auctioneer. $25, he said slowly, as if he wasn't entirely sure what protocol applied here. Yes, I said. Any other bids? He looked around the room. The khaki men had stopped smiling. They were looking at me with expressions I couldn't fully interpret. Not quite pity. Not quite amusement. Something more complicated, like men recalculating something they'd assumed was settled. Nobody else bid. Sold, the auctioneer said, and brought down his gavel. And I walked forward and handed over my $25 and received a signed receipt and a deed to a building I'd never been inside in my life. The walk to Route 9 took about 40 minutes. I could have spent 3 of my remaining dollars on a bus ride. But I walked because I needed the time to prepare myself for what I might find. I'd been building a story in my head for 2 days about the possibilities in that old building, and I knew from experience that reality has a way of being significantly less cooperative than the stories we tell ourselves. Better to arrive tired and realistic than fresh and already disappointed. I saw it from the road before I reached the parking lot. The sign was still there, faded to the point of illegibility, but you could make out the shape of the letters. The windows were boarded up, yes, but the boards were still holding, which meant the structure was at least trying to maintain itself. The roof looked intact from the outside, no visible collapses. The parking lot was a disaster, cracked and heaved and overtaken by weeds, but the building itself had a stubborn solidity to it, the way things built in the 1960s often do. The front door was padlocked. I walked around back and found a door that was simply stuck, swollen with moisture, and when I put my shoulder into it 3 times, it gave way with a sound like a long exhale. The smell hit me first. Grease and mildew and time, decades of griddle smoke had soaked into every surface, and layered over that was the particular smell of a building that had been sealed and left to breathe its own air for 2 years. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes adjust. The kitchen was still there, intact, not in working order, but structurally intact. The counters were stainless steel, dull, and spotted with rust in places but solid. The old griddle was still bolted to the counter. The hood ventilation above it had pulled away from the wall at one corner. There were boxes stacked along the back wall, old supply deliveries that had never been unpacked, and whatever was in them had gone bad long ago based on the smell, but the boxes themselves told me someone had been running a real operation here not so very long ago. The front dining area was worse. 3 of the booths had collapsed. Their vinyl seats split and rotted. 2 ceiling tiles had fallen. There was a water stain on the floor that mapped out an old leak, probably from a winter pipe burst. A layer of dust over everything that was thick enough to write in. But the bones were good. I walked the perimeter, pressing my hands against the walls the way a doctor presses against a patient's abdomen, checking for resistance, checking for what was underneath. The exterior walls were concrete block, solid as the day they were poured. The interior framing, where I could see it through the damaged ceiling tiles, was still straight. The foundation, from what I could tell by looking at the floor, hadn't shifted. This building was not dead. It was waiting. I sat down on one of the intact bar stools at the counter, which was still bolted to the floor, and I looked at the room. I didn't think about the scope of the work. I didn't think about the fact that I had no tools, no money, no experience in commercial renovation, no plan. I thought about one thing only. Tonight, I had a roof over my head, a locked door between me and the parking lot, and 4 walls. That was more than I'd had 2 days ago, on a bench outside the library. I found food on the 3rd day, and I want to say clearly how that happened, because I've learned that the version of a story where a man simply doesn't eat for 2 weeks is not a true version of any story, and I've never seen the point in pretending otherwise. A man named Earl pulled into the parking lot on the 3rd morning while I was trying to pry a collapsed booth frame off the floor. He ran the gas station half a mile up, Route 9. He'd seen me going in and out and had decided to come find out what was happening rather than spend another week wondering. I told him I'd bought the property at auction. He looked at the deed I showed him. He looked at me. He looked at the building. He went back to his truck and came back with 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil and a large coffee and set them on the counter without ceremony. "This is from the machine at the station," he said. "It's not great coffee, but it's hot." Then he looked around at what I was trying to do and he said, "You need a pry bar." Earl brought a pry bar the next day. And the day after that he brought a bag of groceries, nothing elaborate. Bread and peanut butter and a box of crackers and some apples. He never made it into a gesture. He just put the bag on the counter like it was part of the regular business of being a neighbor and got to work helping me. He'd spent 10 years doing maintenance on commercial properties before he bought the gas station, and he knew things about how buildings were put together that I would never have figured out on my own. The first week, we cleared the kitchen. It was brutal work. My hands blistered and split, and the blisters filled and split again, and my lower back locked up twice, badly enough that I had to sit on the floor for 20 minutes before I could stand up. Earl never commented on any of it. He just worked alongside me and handed me things when I needed them, and we moved through that kitchen like 2 men who'd worked together for years, which was remarkable because we'd known each other for 4 days. On the 6th day, I found the pipe. I'd been pulling out the damaged ceiling tiles in the back storage area, trying to assess the structural damage from the old leak, when a section of wall paneling came away, and behind it, I saw the copper pipe. Old pipe, the kind they put in during the original construction, running vertically up the wall, and next to it, tucked into the wall cavity, wrapped in a plastic bag that had kept out most of the moisture, was a ledger book. I'm not a man who believes in signs. I'm too old and have seen too much to think the universe arranges things for the benefit of individual people. But I opened that ledger book and found 23 years of records from the original owner. Every supplier, every contact, every note about the building's maintenance history, what had been fixed, when, and by whom, a complete operational history of the building I now owned, written in a neat hand by a man named George Mallory, who had spent his working life in this building and clearly loved it. I sat on the floor of that storage room, and I read it cover to cover. George had last updated it 8 months before his stroke. On the final page, In handwriting slightly shakier than the rest, he'd written, "Whoever's reading this, the foundation's solid. The roof needs the northwest corner checked every spring. The walk-in cooler compressor is older than my marriage, but it runs if you treat it right. Take care of her." I closed the ledger and held it in both hands for a moment. Then I put it carefully back in the plastic bag and set it on the counter where it would stay dry. 3 weeks in, my daughter-in-law showed up. I heard the car first. A nice car, the kind that sounds expensive even at low speed, pulling into the cracked parking lot with the careful precision of someone who doesn't want to damage their tires on the debris. I was working on the front windows, trying to assess whether the boards could come down or needed to stay for another season, and I turned around when I heard the door. She walked across the parking lot in shoes that weren't designed for parking lots. She looked at the building the way people look at things they find incomprehensible, with a slight forward tilt of the head like she was trying to understand what she was seeing from a better angle. "You've got to be kidding me," she said. "This is what you're doing?" I waited. She pulled an envelope from her purse, held it out to me. "Your son and I have been talking," she said, and I could hear the script in her voice, the rehearsed cadence of someone who'd worked out what they were going to say and was delivering it. "We think it would be best if you signed over power of attorney. For your own protection. At your age, managing property, it's a liability. We can help you get into something more appropriate. A facility." "A facility?" I looked at the envelope. I didn't take it. "I want to see the document," I said. She blinked. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected either acquiescence or anger, and I gave her neither. I asked to see the specific document, what exactly it authorized, who the designated agent would be. She opened the envelope, and as I read it, I understood two things simultaneously. The first was that this was not about protecting me. The document gave my daughter-in-law, not my son, sole authority over any property or financial decisions in my name. The second was that this was not the first time she'd done something like this. That thought arrived quietly, the way important thoughts often do. Not the first time. Because why would a woman drive 40 minutes to a condemned diner to get power of attorney over a man with $0 in his bank account and a piece of paper saying he owned a ruined building? Unless the ruined building wasn't the point. Unless there was something else. I handed the document back to her. "No," I said. Her expression went flat in a way that scared me more than anger would have. She said, "You don't understand how much trouble you're going to be in if you keep refusing to cooperate." Then she turned and walked back to her car and drove away without looking back. I stood in the parking lot for a long time after she left. Then I called my son. He didn't pick up. I left a message. I said, "I love you. I need you to call me back. Something is wrong, and I need you to know what I know." He didn't call back that day, or the next. But I made another call that same afternoon, to the county assessor's office, asking about the history of the deed to my house. The house I'd built and lived in for 40 years. The house I'd been removed from. What they told me took me 3 days to fully process. The house had been refinanced twice in the last 4 years. The second refinancing had included a co-signatory, my daughter-in-law, and the documents authorizing that co-signatory included my signature, my name, my social security number, my handwriting on the consent forms. I had never signed those forms. Earl listened to all of it that evening, sitting on the counter stools in the diner with 2 cups of gas station coffee between us. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need a lawyer, not tomorrow, today, and you need to stop answering any calls or documents from anyone in your family until you have one." I called the county legal aid office the next morning. A woman named Patricia took my case. She was not warm and she was not gentle, but she was thorough in a way that I found more comforting than either warmth or gentleness would have been. She asked for everything, every document, every date, every memory. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she said, "This is fraud. It's been ongoing. We can prove it." And then she said something I hadn't expected. "There are federal protections for elder financial exploitation. This falls under them." I want to be precise about the timeline, because the comments on videos like this often ask why the person didn't call the police sooner, and it's a fair question. I didn't call anyone sooner because I didn't know what I knew. I didn't have the documents in front of me. I didn't have evidence that what felt wrong was legally provable wrong. The moment I had something concrete to show, I acted on it immediately. That's what I'd tell anyone in a similar situation. The moment you have paper, move. While Patricia was working through the legal process, I was working through the diner. Earl brought his nephew, a young man named Marcus, who was studying for his electrician's license and needed supervised hours. In exchange for helping rewire the kitchen, Marcus got Earl's endorsement for his license. In exchange for hosting Marcus's supervised hours, I got working electrical in the kitchen within 3 weeks. That's how things work in small towns when you stop expecting the world to hand you things and start figuring out what you have to trade. A woman named Gloria, who ran the church that had fed me that second day, heard about what I was doing and showed up one Saturday with 4 members of her congregation and a truck full of cleaning supplies. They descended on the dining area like a force of nature. By the end of the day, the floor was visible. The remaining booths were assessed and 3 determined to be salvageable, and the windows were cleaned on the inside. I fed them all grilled cheese sandwiches that I made on the griddle, which was working again, and in the steam and the smell of butter and bread, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: belonging. It was during one of those work sessions that Earl said something I've thought about many times since. He was helping me install a new section of counter, and he stopped and looked up at me and said, "You know what George Mallory's customers used to say about this place? They said it felt like somewhere. Most diners just feel like diners. This one felt like somewhere. I want it to feel like somewhere again," I said. "Then make it feel like somewhere," Earl said. "That's all a place is. Somebody deciding it ought to be one." My son came to see me in November. He came alone. He pulled into the parking lot in his own car, the older one, not the nice one that was my daughter-in-law's, and he sat in the car for a long time before he got out. I watched him from inside, and I didn't go out to meet him. He needed to walk to me. That was important, and I knew it even then. When he came through the door and saw the inside of the diner, he stopped. He looked at the counter, at the clean windows, at the booths I'd repaired, at the functioning lights above the grill. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I didn't know it was going to be like this," he finally said. I poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the counter, and sat down across from him, and I said, "Tell me what you did know." It came out slowly, the way things come out when a person has been carrying them for a long time and the weight has become more unbearable than the telling. "She'd handled all the finances since the beginning," he said. He'd trusted her because it was easier to trust than to pay attention. She'd told him I'd asked to have her name added to the refinancing documents, that I'd wanted it. He'd had no reason to doubt it. He'd never seen the actual documents himself. He didn't know about the power of attorney attempt until Patricia's office had sent a formal letter. "And the house," he said. He looked down at the counter. "I was told you'd agreed to sell, that you'd wanted to downsize, that it was your idea." "When did I ever say that?" I asked. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face was one of a man who has just understood something he should have understood much earlier, and who is now doing the painful work of calculating how much it has cost him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We sat there for a long time. Finally, he said, "What do I need to do?" Patricia had the answer to that question already prepared. The investigation moved faster than I expected, partly because my daughter-in-law had not been careful about digital records, partly because the county assessor's office had documentation that was straightforward to authenticate, and partly because, as Patricia explained to me without drama, elder financial exploitation cases had become a prosecutorial priority in the state, and the DA's office wanted this one. My son cooperated fully. His testimony was essential. I don't know exactly what that cost him, and I've never asked. My daughter-in-law was charged on 11 counts: fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She hired a good lawyer, but the evidence was not the kind that lawyers can argue away, because the evidence was paper, and paper doesn't care about arguments. I didn't feel triumph when I heard the charges. I want to say that clearly, because people expect you to feel triumph and then feel unsatisfied when you do, because triumph is thin and doesn't last. What I felt was something more like relief. The long-held breath finally released. The tension that had been sitting in my shoulders for years, longer than I'd known it was there, finally beginning to ease. My son came to see me again the week after the charges were filed. He brought his tools this time. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just showed up with his tools and looked at me and said, "What needs doing?" We worked side by side that whole day without talking much. We put up new drywall in the back storage room. We didn't need to talk about what had happened. The work talked for us. The way work between fathers and sons sometimes does when words have run out or aren't sufficient. He had his mother's way of working, careful and methodical, checking twice before cutting once. I noticed that and didn't say it, but I held it. The diner opened on the first Saturday in March. I'm not going to pretend it was some grand occasion. It wasn't. It was Earl and Marcus and Gloria and 3 women from her church, and my son and me, and I made eggs and hash browns and coffee on the old griddle, which ran exactly as well as George Mallory's ledger had promised it would if you treated it right. We didn't charge anything that day. People came in off Route 9, curious about the lights they'd seen on through the winter, and they sat down, and I brought them food, and they ate, and they talked to each other and to me, and by noon the place was full, and I had to send Earl to the gas station for more eggs. A man named Dwight, who'd driven past the diner every day for 20 years, sat at the counter and ate 2 eggs over easy and looked around at the room and said, "I stopped coming when George had his stroke. I figured it was gone for good. I'm glad it's not gone." It was a small thing to say, and it was everything. I thought about my house. Not with bitterness. Just thought about it. The house I'd built. The house I'd lost. The house that had been traded and signed away around me while I wasn't watching. Patricia told me there was a legal path to reclaiming it, that the transfer documents were fraudulent and could be contested. She was probably right, but I'd learned something over those months in the diner, something that I couldn't have understood when I was still living in that house. I didn't need to go back to it. I needed to be somewhere, and I was somewhere. I was exactly somewhere. My Social Security check arrives on time every month and goes toward the diner's operating costs. Earl gives me a discount on supplies he orders through the gas station. Gloria's church sends volunteers on Saturdays to help with the weekend rush. Marcus, who now has his full electrician's license, handles any electrical issue in exchange for breakfast whenever he comes by. The roof's northwest corner gets checked every spring. Just like George Mallory said, there are 3 regular customers who come in every morning before 7. An older man who reads the paper and drinks 3 cups of coffee and never orders food. A woman who works the early shift at the hospital and comes in for hash browns and silence before her day begins. A teenager who comes in on school mornings and I have never charged because I can see the hunger in the way he eats and I understand something about hunger now that I didn't understand before. I keep the lights on later than I need to. Route 9 at night is dark. The diner's windows throw a long rectangle of yellow light across the parking lot, visible from a distance. Visible to anyone driving past who might need a place to stop. I've had people come in at 9, 10 o'clock. Not hungry exactly, just needing somewhere. I always let them stay. People in town have started calling it the corner light. I didn't name it that. Somebody else did, and then everybody else started using it, and now it's just what it is. The corner light on Route 9. A place where the lights are on and the door is open and there's food and there's no judgment about why you walked in or what you're carrying. I think about the man who handed me a garbage bag and told me I had 3 hours. I think about standing on that porch with $25 in my wallet. I think about the county notices board and the paper half hidden under the piano teacher flyer. I think about Earl showing up with a pry bar. About George Mallory's ledger telling me the foundation was solid. About my son standing in the parking lot with his tools, asking what needed doing. None of those things were accidents. I don't mean the universe arranged them. I mean that I was open to them. I was desperate enough and humbled enough and stripped down enough to notice them when they appeared, and to choose them, and to do the work that followed each choice. That's the whole story. The rest is just detail. A man asked me once what I'd tell someone who was where I'd been. 60-something. Broke. Cast out, trying to figure out if there was still a road forward. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told him, "Find the thing that costs what you have. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter if people laugh. The thing that costs exactly what you have in your pocket right now, That's the thing that's yours to build. Not because it's perfect. Not because it makes sense. Because it's the thing that is asking to be built, and you're the one standing in front of it. The rest, I told him, is just showing up every morning and doing the work. The coffee's always on. The lights are always burning. If you're on Route 9 and you need somewhere, you'll see them from the road. Just come in.